welcome back to Today in Space. As always, I'm your space science podcast host from the East Coast, Alex G. Orfanos, and today we're diving into the return of Crew 9 to Earth. After several months of orbiting Earth on the space station, these astronauts splashed down, and even the dolphins came to welcome them back home on Earth. It was a beautiful day for human spaceflight, and on board Crew 9 were astronauts Nick Hague, rookie cosmonaut Alexander Gorbanov, and the Starliner crewmates Suni Williams and Butch Wilmore, the so-called stranded astronauts in space. We'll talk more about why that's being thrown around a lot over the last year and what we think about it. But we're going to unpack it all. How long they were up there, the wild Starliner Saga that's finally wrapped up, and what those astronauts must be feeling with all this gravity again after a little time with zero-G life. So buckle up and let's dive into this week's episode. Thanks for joining us. So let's talk about the crew, because after all, this is a human spaceflight mission. First up, we've got Nick Hague, and he's a NASA astronaut and the commander of this mission. He launched on September 28th, 2024, and splashed down on March 18th, 2025. That's 171 days in space, or about 5.5 months. An interesting note about Nick Hague is on his rookie mission to space, his first launch, the Roscosmos Soyuz actually had to perform an abort mid-flight, grounding Nick and the crew before getting to space. It's truly incredible that Nick not only went back up to space afterwards, but continues to do so. Now he's a spaceflight expert, and we're just in awe of Nick's determination and taste for adventure into the final frontier after his very first mission. Next was Alexander Gorbanov, a Russian cosmonaut and mission specialist. He flew up with Nick Hague originally and was in space for 171 days as well. The International Space Station is really an important cultural icon for humanity and peace on Earth, for what we can find of it. Even though we deal with the madness back on Earth with borders and the wars over them, the ISS orbits above it all, and the borders are blurred and not visible, and everyone on board needs to work together to survive and thrive on the space station. I do hope when the commercial space stations replace the ISS that we have more international partnerships that blur the border lines and help us focus on how we can work together to survive and thrive on the adventure of orbiting Earth and being in space. And before we talk about the two other crewmates on Crew 9, let's talk about why Crew 9 originally launched with 2 spare seats for these stranded astronauts. Now, Nick and Alexander originally had 2 other crew members on board Crew 9 to fill the other seats. But when the Starliner Calypso was deemed to have too much risk for the 2 astronauts to return, NASA had to make the 2 seats available for the Starliner astronauts to return. The 2 NASA astronauts taken off the Crew 9 mission to make room for them were Zena Cardman and Stephanie Wilson. Zena Cardman was supposed to be the commander on her first space mission, and Stephanie Wilson, famous 3-time space shuttle astronaut and the second African-American woman in space, was to be the mission specialist. But when NASA decided to send Starliner back robotically and uncrewed, astronauts Zena and Stephanie were benched to free up the seats. The 2 of them appeared on NASA's coverage of the Crew 9 launch, sharing their professional astronaut takes on what happened. Both of them shared how much they loved their crew for Crew 9 and that it was really just about the 2 Starliner astronauts, fellow humans, that needed to get home. But now that the Starliner Saga is over, I do hope these 2 women find their way back on a crewed mission to the space station. And soon. They've certainly earned it. And that brings us to the final members of the Crew 9 mission, the Starliner duo, astronauts Suni Williams and Butch Wilmore. Suni and Butch launched on Boeing's Starliner Calypso on June 5th, 2024, and was intended to be Starliner's first crewed flight test for 8 days total. We covered this extensively each week as the Starliner Saga played out in real time last summer, and we were staying up. You can check out episodes 343, episode 348, episode 350, which is when things started to go wrong for Starliner. Episode 351, we did a breakdown of top 4 media questions from that press conference. 353, 355, and 359. So plenty to dig in there. But Suni and Butch ended up staying on the space station for 286 days total. That's 9.5 months in space. Suni's new record is now 608 days in space, and that's across her career with 3 space flights. This makes Suni Williams the second most experienced female astronaut ever, just behind Peggy Whitson, with 675 days in space over 4 missions, and another one coming up soon for Axiom Space. And Butch Wilmore has now recorded over 464 days in space across 3 missions in his career. So, the Starliner Saga. What happened up there? The Starliner Saga has really evolved over the last year, and we covered the engineering problems that NASA and Boeing had to troubleshoot on the thrusters, and how NASA internally had enough doubt and people had spoken up enough for them to have Starliner get reprogrammed to return without crew robotically. And then SpaceX was chosen by NASA at that time to return Suni and Butch in early 2025. At that time, I believe they were supposed to return in January/February, and then there were some schedule slips that ended up bringing the return back to March of 2025. There was also some work that SpaceX was doing to try and get a Crew Dragon ready by itself, but they were unable to get it ready in time before NASA's decision. And once the decision to have Suni and Butch come back on Crew 9 was made, there were also more delays that ended up happening. So logistically, it was very difficult for NASA to find a way to get those 2 astronauts back. But ultimately, the original plan that NASA had made or decided to make about returning the astronauts in early 2025 ended up being the reason they came back. Now, the news narrative was that NASA and Boeing stranded these 2 astronauts in space on board the space station, with many people simply grazing the topic and not realizing that the Starliner crew was on the space station with other crewmates. I mean, there's plenty of people who thought they were stuck in Starliner by itself in space, which is just not true. And then others didn't even know that these astronauts were also busy working and doing science on the ISS. And there's just a lot of people that don't know what it's like to work and live in space right now. And I get it, unless you're following it as closely as me and some of the other fellow extreme space nerds here, you would never know that. So there's definitely a lot to learn about the public's perception of human spaceflight from this Starliner saga and the way that the news made it seem or was choosing to discuss the story. I've had a lot of issue with the constant narrative of the astronauts being stranded in space. And while, in my opinion, the astronauts really were never stranded in space, I did want to look up the actual definition of the word so that we could talk about that instead of maybe just my opinion on the whole situation, which I wasn't a fan of. One of the definitions for the word stranded is lacking what is necessary to leave a place or to get out of a situation. Now, Starliner landed on September 7th, 2024, and Crew 9 docked to the International Space Station on September 29th, 2024. So the whole stranded astronaut scenario, if it was ever true, was only for those few weeks between September 7th and September 29th, 2024. And since then, Suni and Butch became a part of the Crew 9 thanks to the professional astronauts Zena and Stephanie for freeing up those seats. And then, of course, because the election happened right after Crew 9 was sent to space, it was an easy political football for the narrative that the Biden administration stranded the astronauts in space. Now, for anyone that's followed us for a long time, we really don't like the politicization of these things, especially human spaceflight, and especially because the media had such a large role in the space shuttle launch pressure around Challenger and Columbia. And while the teams involved with the decision definitely held the responsibility of what happened to those crews, the media pressure of having these launches happen when they wanted to, as opposed to when the rocket and spacecraft were ready, added to the fire. So I am definitely going to fight against these narratives that are just putting pressure on these human spaceflight missions when the topmost priority should be the safety of those human beings. And there's plenty of things to dive into that I'm not even privy to, of the conversations that happen behind the scenes, right, for NASA. But the way that Elon Musk and Trump are framing this, the way that the media has framed this, I really don't think that those narratives are what they were. And if the astronauts were ever stranded, again, it was only during September of 2024 of last year. So to see that continuing to be used today is irritating. And I will concede that there was a period where the astronauts were stranded without a vehicle. I didn't look into the details. There may have been some spare seats on a Soyuz. I believe the Russians helped during that period. But this is the kind of thing that we've seen before in spaceflight, and I just wanted to go through the timeline to set the record straight. You know, for me, when this gets political and just a little crazy, what I like to focus on are the people that are involved in making this happen. Not the people who are the figureheads of the organization, not the leaders of NASA, not the leaders of SpaceX, the owner of SpaceX, or the president that's involved at that time. I focus on the people actually doing things, actually building the spacecraft, checking the spacecraft, running mission control, and doing everything behind the scenes. So to me, it was just great that all those teams came together, worked together regardless of all the madness, and got the mission done. So to close out, why does Crew 9 and the close of the Starliner Saga matter? Regardless of the political nature of this return flight, I have heard more from people about this mission and Starliner than I have on many other historic space events over the last 10 years. The traction online is also much more than I usually see, and of course there are politics and madness in the comments and the chat. But this is human spaceflight, and it's engaged so many people, and the safe return and splashdown brought people previously not watching space events back into the fold. So it was a great moment for the progress of space and human spaceflight in particular. And NASA successfully created a backup plan, right, using 2 different human-rated spacecraft, and brought the crew home safely, something they've never been able to do, sending another spacecraft to return crew. Never happened in NASA history, and it happened for the first time successfully. Even in the space shuttle days, they weren't able to turn around a space shuttle, and it seemed like the same thing happened with Crew Dragon, where there wasn't a separate one available, and they just had to free up seats. But regardless, it worked. And SpaceX played an integral role in having developed their Crew Dragon earlier than Starliner, even though they started at the same time. And that way, if testing showed that issues happened, like it did with Starliner or any other spacecraft, there would be another human-rated spacecraft either in the queue in the mission already, or possibly one that hadn't been used yet or dedicated to a mission so that they could bring them home. And on top of that, NASA and America did not have to work with Russia to return their astronauts when they were stranded in September. And I worry that in that timeline and alternate universe, it could have been used as a political motive for Russia to stop the U.S. involvement in Ukraine, basically requiring that if they were going to save our astronauts, that we would have to stop fighting the war in Ukraine or supplying Ukraine with weapons. If that happened, I worry that NASA could have, in that scenario, chosen to send both astronauts back on Starliner, regardless of how risky it was. And that would have been a disaster scenario. So all in all, it was a great day for human space flight and space progress, and a little bit of hope and joy for those who watched the splashdown. So that's all we have on this one, space nerds. Thanks for joining us. Please make sure to like and subscribe to us on YouTube for more space content. Listen and subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your audio podcasts. And follow us online at Today in Space on TikTok, Today in Space Pod on X and Instagram, Today in Space on Blue Sky, and Today in Space Podcast on Facebook. And you can always email us at todayinspacepodcast@gmail.com if you want to tell us what you loved about the episode, if you had any questions, or if you'd like us to dive into further topics. We're here for it. So send us an email or a message online. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, spread love, spread science, and be well. We'll see you in the next episode of Today in Space. See ya.